Hey guys, tonight we are setting off on a strange little journey through dim candlelit corridors of memory, chasing the slippery idea of what might have been history's biggest cover-up. You've heard people toss around the phrase the Dark Ages before, like it was some 500-year cosmic blackout where nothing happened, everyone forgot how to read, and maybe folks were just running around bumping into each other in muddy fields. But here's the fun twist. That whole picture might itself be the cover-up. A story painted over another story. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, I'd love for you to drop a comment with your location and what time it is where you're listening, because it always blows my mind to imagine this sleepy little history campfire flickering across so many different time zones at once. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You picture yourself trudging down a long, uneven path, torches flickering against stone walls, parchment crumbling in your hands. The label Dark Ages hangs heavy in the air, like a moth-eaten cloak somebody tossed over an entire era. It's a phrase first used by Renaissance scholars, then recycled gleefully by Enlightenment thinkers who love to pat themselves on the back for being the age of reason. They wanted a good foil, a before picture so gloomy that their after picture looked dazzling by comparison. But here's the reality check. If you really dropped into 9th century Europe, you probably wouldn't survive very long. You'd be baffled by the food, the smells, the drafty houses, and the sheer lack of Wi-Fi. Imagine explaining TikTok to Charlemagne. He'd probably assign a monk to copy it all out by hand on calfskin. And yet, even in those drafty halls, people were writing, trading, farming with clever techniques, preserving libraries, and building churches so huge they still tower over modern skylines. Historians still argue whether the Dark Ages were truly dark at all, or whether they were simply painted that way later. One mainstream fact you can hold on to: the term media etis, the Middle Ages, came from Renaissance Italy, where scholars needed to separate themselves from what they thought was a dreary midpoint between ancient glory and modern genius. Here's a quirky tidbit. The poet Petrarch, in the 14th century, actually coined the phrase Dark Age, while grumbling that his own time lacked enough classical writers. It wasn't meant as a global insult, but rather as a moody writer's sigh. Over centuries, though, that sigh got stretched into an entire myth. Picture one man's bad review of his contemporaries turning into a full-blown TripAdvisor rating for half a millennium. Would not recommend, 1 star, no aqueducts. Meanwhile, manuscripts continued to be copied in abbeys. Islamic scholars preserved Greek philosophy in translation. Chinese printing presses cranked out texts long before Gutenberg, and Jewish communities passed along complex debates and commentaries. If this was total darkness, it was a strangely well-lit one. You shuffle through the corridors of this invented narrative, the torchlight revealing how much was airbrushed out. Kings and popes leaned into the story because it gave them leverage. If the past was lost, then they could present themselves as the noble restorers. Historians still argue whether this was conscious branding or just the way power naturally writes itself. But you can almost feel the tug of erasers at the edges of history's pages, smudging inconvenient details and blowing on the ink until only the approved tale remained. And as you drift deeper into this exploration, your eyelids might already feel a little heavier. There's a rhythm to the walking, a soft echo of footsteps on old stones, the scent of dust and beeswax candles filling the air. a long sleep-colored corridor where the so-called Dark Ages turn out not to be so dark at all, but rather hidden behind someone else's carefully placed curtain. You carry that torch forward, past the first doorway, and into a hall where words themselves seem to hover like ghostly banners. The phrase Dark Ages was never an archaeological lair you could dig up with a spade. It was a label, an invention, a kind of branding campaign, like calling Brussels sprouts baby cabbages to make them more appealing. Only in this case, the branding made a whole era look unappealing on purpose. It starts with Renaissance Italy, somewhere around the 14th and 15th centuries. Humanists like Petrarch, who we already mentioned sighing about the lack of Ciceros and Virgils in his own time, weren't actually saying no one was writing or thinking. He was saying no one was writing or thinking in the classical Latin style he adored. Fast forward a bit, and his literary grumble became a wider cultural insult. Later scholars lumped several centuries into one dimly lit bin so that they themselves could shine brighter by contrast. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Enlightenment thinkers doubled down. Voltaire, for example, treated medieval centuries like a messy attic best locked away so he could show off the new salon downstairs. He praised reason, science, and clarity. And those ideas sparkled more when you set them against a backdrop of supposed ignorance. Historians still argue whether this was an innocent overgeneralization or a deliberate act of propaganda, but either way, it stuck. Here's your mainstream fact for this stretch. The phrase Middle Ages itself became standard thanks to Christoph Cellarius, a 17th century historian who divided history into three clean chunks: ancient, medieval, modern. It was neat, it was tidy, and people love neat categories. Unfortunately, reality rarely fits into three drawers like socks. And for your quirky tidbit, during the Renaissance, writers would sometimes literally dig up ruins and scribble on them to prove the superiority of antiquity over the dark times in between. One rumor tells of inscriptions mysteriously appearing on ancient stones, suspected by some to be forgeries, crafted to make the classical age look grander by comparison. Imagine someone faking Yelp reviews for Julius Caesar just to drag medieval bakers. As you stroll further down this narrative corridor, you notice the walls painted with scenes of scholars sketching ancient statues, admiring Roman coins, and quoting Cicero as if repeating his words could conjure him back into the room. Meanwhile, they ignored the fact that medieval mathematicians were crunching numbers, medieval farmers were inventing the heavy plow, and medieval architects were engineering Gothic cathedrals so complex they still make modern engineers squint. There's also the little matter of cross-cultural continuity. While European scholars were busy painting over their own Middle Ages with shadows, knowledge was still flowing across borders. Arabic translations of Aristotle, preserved and expanded by Islamic scholars, drifted back into Europe through Spain. Jewish scholars wrote commentaries that preserved philosophical arguments otherwise lost. Chinese dynasties were printing entire libraries. Darkness? More like dim candlelight in one room of a bustling mansion. And yet, the myth had momentum. Because here's the sly thing, calling the past dark gave the present more sparkle. It's the oldest marketing trick in the book. Sell your era by making the competition look dreadful, and it worked. Even today, schoolbooks often glide past several centuries with a shrug, as though nothing worth mentioning happened until knights showed up for a cameo, and then suddenly, everyone remembered how to paint again. Historians still argue whether this was a conscious plot or just the natural result of narrative laziness. After all, it's much easier to say long, boring darkness than to parse out centuries of complicated social and cultural evolution. But somewhere between simplification and distortion, a whole era was shoved under the rug, leaving students yawning at a false story while the real one whispered from the margins. You picture yourself now setting the torch down on a carved ledge. The flame flickers, shadows ripple over painted frescoes, and the word dark trembles as though it might smudge away entirely if you breathe too hard. The invention of this label wasn't a discovery, it was a cover-up, a narrative convenience, a curtain drawn across a window that could have let in more light. And as you lean against the stone, the corridor seems to lengthen ahead, promising stranger secrets still waiting in the shelves beyond. You press deeper into that shadowy hallway, and soon you're not looking at shiny slogans from the Renaissance anymore. You're standing inside a hushed stone chamber. It smells faintly of beeswax, ink, and something musty, like leather binding stacked too long in a damp corner. The flicker of your torch catches rows upon rows of manuscripts, each painstakingly copied by hand, each page the product of one monk's steady hours bent over a desk. This is where the next act of the cover-up happened, not in grand declarations, but in the quiet act of choosing what to copy and what to let fade into silence. Monks in monasteries were the guardians of knowledge for centuries, which sounds noble until you realize guardians can also be gatekeepers. Mainstream fact: in the so-called Dark Ages, the monastic scriptoria across Europe preserved thousands of works, biblical texts, ancient authors like Virgil, bits of Aristotle, practical manuals. Without them, whole languages might have been lost. Yet every decision they made shaped what survived. Copying was expensive, time-consuming, and subject to strict priorities. If an abbot decided Aristotle was useful, but a bawdy Roman satire was not, the satire simply didn't get recopied. Over time, silence replaced survival. Now, for the quirky tidbit, some of those discarded works didn't just vanish quietly. Scribes reused the parchment itself. This created what we now call palimpsests, parchment pages scraped clean and overwritten with holier or more practical texts. Modern scholars using ultraviolet light have discovered ancient plays, lost gospels, and obscure treatises hiding beneath sermons. It's like finding a deleted text message buried under a grocery list. Imagine opening your notebook and realizing your to-do list for the day is written over Plato's lost lecture notes. Historians still argue whether this was censorship or just practicality. After all, parchment came from animal skins, which weren't exactly cheap. You could argue that erasing a pagan poem to copy the Psalms wasn't sinister. It was just cost-effective. But others say that silence accumulates power. When centuries of bawdy plays, female authors, and radical philosophies quietly disappear, the shape of the past changes. It starts to look cleaner, holier, and far more obedient to authority than it ever actually was. Picture the monk himself, hood pulled low, quill scratching on vellum, muttering under his breath about how cold it is in the scriptorium. He has a limited number of daylight hours, and candlelight is dangerous near parchment. He selects a text, dips the quill, and starts copying. Maybe he accidentally doodles a funny little animal in the margin, just to keep himself sane. Maybe he miscopies a line, forever changing the meaning. You don't hear his sighs centuries later, but you see the result. Whole philosophies vanish, whole ideas reduced to footnotes, and in the middle of it all, something eerie: the silence on women. Legal codes and chronicles had little reason to preserve the stories of women who ran businesses, fought in wars, or practiced medicine. When midwives left records, They were often ignored or condemned as dangerous. Imagine how different the story of the Middle Ages would look if more of those voices had been copied with the same reverence given to Aristotle. As you shuffle past the shelves in this imaginary library, you notice certain books glow brighter than others. The Bible shines like a beacon. Augustine's works are glowing too. But over in the shadowy corners are piles of unlit manuscripts, recipes, plays, letters, bawdy poems left in darkness. They whisper faintly, their voices muffled by centuries of neglect. You can almost hear them asking, "Why not us? Why not our stories?" And here's the sly joke hiding under all this seriousness. Somewhere, some poor monk got stuck copying out a legal code about pig ownership regulations, while the pages of an ancient Greek comedy sat crumbling in the next room. It's the medieval equivalent of binge-watching insurance commercials while tossing the last surviving season of a hit TV show into the fireplace. The deeper you wander, the more you realize the Dark Ages weren't dark because nothing was happening. They were dark because certain lights were snuffed out on purpose, while others were allowed to burn. A curated past, glowing in selective candlelight, where silence was every bit as powerful as words on a page. The torch in your hand sputters as if reacting to that thought, and the air in the chamber feels thicker now. You've seen how easy it is to shape memory, not with loud declarations, but with quiet decisions made one quill stroke at a time. You breathe in the dusty air, step away from the shelves, and feel the corridor stretching further ahead. Somewhere beyond lies another forgery, another layer of the cover-up waiting to be unrolled like parchment beneath your fingertips. The corridor narrows, and when you step into the next chamber, you immediately notice the smell of ink, warm wax, and something slightly fishy, as though the parchment itself knows it's lying to you. Here, on a grand oak desk, rests one of the most notorious forgeries in history, the donation of Constantine. The parchment glows faintly in your torchlight, words curling across the page in solemn Latin script, pretending to carry the authority of an emperor long gone. The story goes like this. Sometime in the 8th century, a document began circulating that claimed Emperor Constantine the Great, yes, the same Constantine who legalized Christianity, had granted the Pope supreme authority over Rome and the western half of the Roman Empire. Imagine the receipt for half the empire being casually scribbled and then lost, only to resurface conveniently when the papacy needed leverage. Mainstream fact. For centuries, this document was treated as gospel truth. Popes wielded it to reinforce claims of supreme power. Kings bowed to its supposed legitimacy, and it shaped European politics like a hidden hand shuffling the chessboard. Nobody openly questioned it until the 15th century, when Lorenzo Valla, a sharp-eyed humanist, examined the Latin and noticed it was full of anachronisms, words and phrases Constantine couldn't possibly have used in the 4th century. His conclusion? The donation was a medieval fake, written centuries after Constantine had already turned to dust. Now, here's your quirky tidbit. One of the most suspicious giveaways wasn't lofty theology or political nuance, but a single word. The document referred to satraps, a Persian administrative title that would have made no sense in Constantine's Rome. It's a bit like reading a presidential speech from George Washington that suddenly mentions Bluetooth. The word alone tipped off scholars that someone, somewhere, was fibbing. Historians still argue whether the forgery was crafted by zealous church officials deliberately trying to boost papal power, or whether it began as a smaller local document that spiraled into something bigger over time. Either way, its existence is one of the clearest examples of how authority isn't always built on truth. It can be cemented by a really persuasive piece of parchment and a lot of trust in people too busy to double check. You step closer to the desk, and the torchlight makes the ink shimmer. It's easy to imagine the medieval clerks nodding solemnly as they copied it, perhaps knowing deep down that something was off, but unwilling to challenge a story that served their employers so well. That's the unsettling part. The cover-up doesn't always require villains twisting mustaches in candlelit corners. Sometimes it only takes ordinary people choosing not to ask questions. And while this forgery looms large, it's not alone. The Middle Ages were full of fabricated relics, discovered saints' bones, and invented genealogies that made royal families seem more legitimate than they were. The donation of Constantine was just the most spectacular of these, an empire-sized forgery that lasted centuries before anyone called its bluff. You can't help but smirk at the absurdity. Imagine a medieval notary stamping this thing and thinking, "Yup, that's airtight. No one will ever notice." And for hundreds of years, no one did. People kissed rings, knelt, paid taxes, and went to war under its authority. One dodgy document practically rewrote the balance of power across Europe. The torch in your hand crackles, and the letters on the page almost seem to squirm. It reminds you that paper trails can be just as deceptive as smoky corridors or flickering shadows. History doesn't only hide behind silence, it can lie brazenly, in black ink, on an official seal. You lean back, letting the absurdity of it settle in. Somewhere in the silence you imagine the ghost of Constantine chuckling at the audacity, shaking his head. Really? They thought I wrote that? But audacity has always been a close friend of power. And in this chamber of parchment and shadows, you realize the biggest cover-up of the so-called Dark Ages wasn't always about what was erased. Sometimes it was about what was forged and carefully slipped into the record, like a counterfeit coin that nobody dared bite down on to test. The corridor yawns open again, promising new erasures, new silences, and new edits just a few steps away. You take your torch, leave the shimmering forgery behind, and walk on toward the next secret shelf of history. The passage opens into a quieter room, lit not by grand parchments but by smaller details. Thin pages, household objects, fragments of letters. You notice how subdued it feels here, as though the voices of those who lived in this space were deliberately turned down to a whisper. This is the chamber of women in the Middle Ages, their stories written in faint ink, often erased, ignored, or rewritten by others. Mainstream fact first. Women weren't absent in medieval Europe. Far from it. Queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine maneuvered armies and politics. Abbesses controlled lands as large as dukedoms. Midwives, merchants, and scribes kept communities running. Yet the chronicles, the official histories written by monks and royal clerks, barely recorded them unless their lives intersected dramatically with men of power. If you were a queen, your name made it into the record. If you were a healer or a merchant, chances are your work dissolved into silence. And the quirky tidbit? In several manuscripts, scholars have found faint traces of women's handwriting, often on the margins of texts. One example comes from a medieval German abbey where nuns scribbled notes and even jokes in the edges of religious texts. They corrected mistakes, doodled, and left tiny pieces of personality where official chronicles would never bother. Imagine centuries later, shining a UV lamp across a page and realizing some nun doodled a sassy little caricature of her abbot in the margin. History's quiet graffiti. Historians still argue whether women were deliberately erased or simply not considered worthy of chronicling in the first place. Was it intentional suppression? Or just the blind spots of scribes who didn't think a midwife's innovations in childbirth or a brewer's control of her alehouse mattered in the grand story of kings and wars? Either way, the effect was the same. A quieter, emptier version of the past than what really happened. You walk deeper into this room, and you picture the daily rhythm. Women stirring great cauldrons in kitchens, weaving tapestries whose vibrant colors carried political messages, passing medical recipes to apprentices. Their knowledge didn't disappear. It circulated orally through families, through guilds, through networks of trust. But the written record preferred battles and bishops. It's as if history's microphone was pointed at the loudest men in the hall, while everyone else had to shout from the corners. One story flickers in your torchlight. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess who composed music, wrote visionary theology, and even dabbled in natural science. She was so brilliant she couldn't be ignored. But even then, much of her legacy was nearly lost, until modern scholars rediscovered it. If Hildegard almost faded, imagine the thousands of lesser-known women whose names never made it into any manuscript at all. And here's a little smirk-worthy joke. Medieval society often claimed women were too fragile for intellectual work, yet we have evidence of women literally grinding pigments, illuminating manuscripts, and hauling stone for cathedrals, while some male clerics were fainting from fasting too long in their cloisters. Fragile indeed. The silence here feels deliberate. As you stand in this chamber, you notice how faint voices seem to float around you. Midwives whispering herbal remedies, brewers boasting about their ale, widows managing estates while their husbands were off crusading. All those voices hover in the margins, erased not by fire, but by neglect. The torch sputters as though urging you to keep moving. Because the cover-up isn't always a forgery like the donation of Constantine. Sometimes it's simply a question of volume. Turn down the dial on half the population, and the record suddenly sounds very different. You move toward the next archway, realizing the corridor ahead may be darker still, filled with shelves of burned libraries and silenced knowledge. The corridor opens into a larger chamber now, one filled with the smell of smoke and charred parchment. You almost stumble over fragments of manuscripts strewn across the floor, brittle with age, the edges curling like fingers reaching for attention. This room is a memorial of what humans have destroyed over time, whether by accident, neglect, or deliberate choice. Libraries burned, entire collections vanished, and yet much of the narrative survives as a patchwork quilt of what didn't get destroyed. Mainstream fact. One of the most infamous incidents was the burning of the Library of Alexandria, often mythologized but emblematic of the many lost repositories of knowledge. In medieval Europe, similar tragedies occurred on smaller, but no less devastating scales. Fires in monasteries, citywide conflagrations, raids, and pillages all contributed. For example, the sacking of Monte Cassino Abbey by Saracens in 883 AD destroyed countless manuscripts, some irreplaceable, forever shifting what we think of as the medieval record. Now here's your quirky tidbit. Some of those lost works might still exist, hidden in plain sight. Scholars have discovered manuscripts bound into other books, used as binding material or padding in later volumes. One 11th century commentary turned up centuries later, tucked inside the cover of a completely unrelated text, like a medieval Easter egg. It's almost as if the knowledge fought its own erasure, sneaking back into view when nobody was paying attention. Historians still argue whether these losses were deliberate censorship or just the inevitable result of fragile materials in a world without fireproof vaults? Was knowledge purposefully suppressed, or were people simply careless, human, and prone to disaster? The line is blurry. Consider, for instance, the repeated destruction of Irish monastic libraries during Viking raids. Some clerics may have tried to hide texts in caves or riverbanks. Others may have simply accepted that paper and vellum weren't immortal. Either way, information vanished. You step carefully over smoldering remnants and imagine the hands that once held them. Scholars, monks, students, all meticulously copying, debating, cataloging. Then comes the moment the flame or sword obliterates their work. You can almost hear the sighs of centuries, a chorus of half-remembered voices, the sound of ideas evaporating like mist over a river. And yet, in some rooms, the margins survive, the occasional doodle, the faint ink trail hinting at what once existed. A playful thought drifts by. Imagine someone in 12th century Paris misplacing a treatise on mechanical clocks, only for it to end up centuries later in a dusty attic where a curious historian finds it under a stack of cheese invoices. It's absurd, but that's the way knowledge often survives, by accident, by luck, or sheer stubbornness. And beyond the fires, there's the question of intentional suppression. Religious authorities sometimes decided that certain texts were too heretical to exist. Political rulers occasionally purged records that could undermine their legitimacy. In these cases, destruction was purposeful, a form of historical editing, less flashy than forgery, but equally effective. You notice the corridor walls seem darker here, almost as if the soot itself is pressing against your skin, reminding you that erasure can be both violent and invisible. Walking further, you stumble upon an overturned lectern, charred remnants of a book still readable if you squint, a fragment of a treatise on astronomy. You run your fingers over it, aware that even in this chamber of losses, tiny threads remain, whispering that knowledge isn't easily extinguished. The room hums with tension between what vanished, what survived, and what future scholars will eventually reconstruct from these scattered ashes. By the time you reach the next archway, your torchlight flickers over another set of shelves. You realize the cover-up isn't just a single act, it's a cascade. Decisions to copy or discard, accidental fires, deliberate purges. And in that cascade, entire centuries can appear darker than they truly were, their richness hidden beneath layers of smoke and ash. The corridor narrows again, leading you into a chamber filled with curious glass jars, metal instruments, and shelves crowded with scrolls you didn't notice before. This is the secretive world where church authority and experimental science intersected, a place where knowledge bubbled in flasks, quills scratched notes on alchemical transformations, and recipes for medicines and remedies were kept deliberately out of public view. Mainstream fact: during the medieval period, many experiments in medicine, chemistry, and even early optics were conducted under the radar, often by monks or court scholars who feared backlash from the church. Alchemy wasn't just about turning lead into gold. It was about understanding nature's transformations. Yet, because some of these studies hinted at knowledge that could challenge authority, details were sometimes kept secret, shared only in ciphered texts or between trusted apprentices. Quirky tidbit: some manuscripts actually encoded recipes using rhymes, riddles, or strange illustrations, a kind of medieval escape room for knowledge. One 14th century medical text describes how to create a balm for headaches using obscure ingredients and cryptic instructions, as if to keep everyone except the initiated guessing. Imagine trying to make a headache salve and ending up with a concoction that smells like burnt marshmallows and might just cure your neighbor's chicken instead. Historians still argue whether the church actively suppressed all scientific investigation or whether much of this secrecy was practical and protective. After all, an explosive chemical experiment in a monastery could get a monk roasted faster than any heresy trial. Some evidence suggests that hiding discoveries was as much about safety as it was about controlling ideas. You wander past shelves lined with jars filled with dried herbs, powders, and curious minerals, imagining the alchemists who handled them. Candlelight glints off glass and metal, highlighting marginal notes like, "Don't try this without a friend nearby," or "Only for the worthy." These annotations speak to a vibrant, if secretive, culture of experimentation, one that had to coexist with dominant theological narratives. One notable example, the experiments with distillation, which monks used to create perfumes, medicines, and even spirits. While ostensibly mundane, these experiments formed the backbone of later chemistry. Yet because the instructions were encoded or hidden, they remained obscure for centuries, accessible only to those willing to decode them. You can almost imagine a monk winking at a successor. Remember, this knowledge is too powerful for ordinary eyes. Here's a playful mental image. Someone centuries later discovers an alchemical recipe for turning silver into gold, only to realize it actually produces a perfectly reasonable, slightly glittery soap. The secrecy makes it feel more mysterious than it ever really was. As you move through this chamber, you notice how power and curiosity dance together. Knowledge could empower, but it could also threaten, and therefore it was kept in the shadows. Some of the most innovative discoveries of the Middle Ages were quietly tucked away, waiting for centuries before rediscovery. It's a subtle form of cover-up, one where history isn't destroyed or falsified, it's simply postponed. The torchlight flickers over a small stack of bound papers, the edges curling as though breathing. You realize that what survives of medieval science often feels accidental, pieced together from secrets that slipped through the cracks, scribbles in margins, or cryptic recipes that somehow persisted. And just beyond this room, you sense that the next section of your journey will take you even further into the whispering margins. The scribbles, notes, and coded insights that history didn't officially record. You step into a narrower, quieter passage, where the air feels almost charged with secrets. Here, the walls themselves seem to lean in, lined with manuscripts and notebooks that were never meant to be noticed. Marginalia, the scribbles, doodles, and cryptic codes in the margins of texts, become your guide. It's a different kind of history, one whispered in tiny ink strokes, where the official narrative is accompanied by the secret chatter of those left in the shadows. Mainstream fact: marginalia in medieval manuscripts often included corrections, commentary, and personal observations. Monks, students, and scribes would add notes ranging from scholarly clarifications to snarky asides about their teachers. These marginal comments provide a window into how knowledge was digested, debated, and sometimes quietly subverted. Without them, much of the lived intellectual life of the period would vanish into silence. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some scribes were more playful than serious, drawing caricatures, little animals, or even tiny games in the margins. In one English manuscript, a knight appears to joust with a fish, while a monk's hat floats above the scene like a comedic UFO. These visual jokes weren't part of the official text, but they give you a sense of personality, levity, and rebellion in spaces otherwise constrained by rules and hierarchy. Imagine a medieval meme carefully hidden in a manuscript for centuries. Some things never change. Historians still argue whether marginalia was primarily educational, subversive, or simply whimsical. Were scribes expressing dissent in coded commentary? Were they sneaking in critiques of authority? Or were they just bored monks with quills in hand, trying to keep their minds sharp during long hours? The answer probably includes all of the above. As you examine the margins, you notice encoded recipes tucked in between lines of text. Some alchemists, herbalists, and healers embedded practical knowledge in riddles or shorthand, ensuring that only those in the know could understand. One recipe for a medicinal ointment requires translating Latin abbreviations, skipping lines, and deciphering a small pictogram that looks like a cat chasing a mouse. It's like a medieval puzzle box for curing headaches or soothing fevers. You can't help but imagine the scribe smiling mischievously while writing it. Ha! If anyone but my apprentice tries this, they'll end up with a lot of smelly goop and no cure. Knowledge itself becomes performative, a game where only the attentive, careful, and persistent gain access to practical truths. The secret margins also record opinions, jokes, and frustrations that never made it into the main narrative. A monk complains about a fellow scribe, a student teases his teacher, or a reader quietly notes that a supposed miracle seems exaggerated. These whispers are fragments of humanity preserved against the official story's insistence on solemnity and piety. As you move along, you notice that history is not only what was recorded, but also what was hidden in plain sight. The margins remind you that cover-ups aren't always about removal or destruction. They can be about concealment, coded messages, or leaving just enough clues for someone centuries later to piece together the real story. You leave this chamber with a sense of wonder. If history is a library, the most interesting books are often the ones that were never meant to be found. The torchlight trembles, highlighting tiny notes and doodles one last time before you step toward the next archway. Ahead lies another form of narrative manipulation, this one darker, closer to fear itself. The official telling of catastrophe, blame, and chaos in the time of the Black Death. You round the corner and find yourself in a hall heavy with smoke and whispers of despair. The Black Death has arrived, though you're not witnessing it firsthand. You're moving through the echoes of its official stories. Governments, clergy, and local authorities all had their own version of events, and the version that survived in official records is a carefully spun narrative designed to preserve order, shift blame, and sometimes cover up failures. Mainstream fact: the Black Death swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, killing an estimated 25 to 50% of the population. Governments and church officials tried to maintain authority by controlling how the plague was described and explained. Chronicles often blamed moral failings, divine wrath, or outsiders, Jews, foreigners, or heretics, rather than admitting the limits of human knowledge or their own inability to stop the epidemic. Quirky tidbit: some cities issued plague permits, bizarrely bureaucratic documents allowing certain tradespeople to continue working in quarantine zones. In Florence, records show that bakers could cross cordoned streets with official passes, while the rest of the population was confined to their homes. Imagine showing up at a bakery in full plague panic, waving a permit, and hoping the guard believes you're a certified dough kneader rather than a secret zombie enthusiast. Historians still argue whether authorities were primarily motivated by maintaining social order or by genuinely trying to help people. Some chroniclers admit that local leaders hoarded supplies, hid failures, and exaggerated successes to keep citizens compliant. Others suggest that even well-meaning policies unintentionally contributed to fear and confusion. Either way, the narrative that survived is as much about control as it is about the actual pandemic. You wander past charred records of city councils, letters from terrified nobles, and sermons preached from pulpits that warn of sin as the cause of death. The repetition of blame, always pointing outward, creates a pattern you can almost follow like footprints in ash. People needed explanations, but those explanations often masked messy realities. Overworked doctors, inadequate quarantines, and the sheer randomness of survival. Here's a sly joke to balance the gloom. One chronicle reports that some townspeople believed carrying a live chicken around their necks would ward off infection. The chicken didn't help, but the absurdity survives in the margins of history, reminding you that humans always look for control, even if it's utterly ridiculous. And yet, through all the manipulation and misinformation, hints of truth persist. Marginal notes reveal remedies tried, numbers of dead recorded discreetly, and personal letters expose the fear and grief that official records glossed over. You notice how narratives were edited not just to record events, but to shape perception, to make sure that citizens remembered the plague in a way that reinforced authority rather than questioning it. Walking further, you sense how delicate the balance was. One misstep in messaging could trigger panic, rebellion, or worse. So, stories were carefully curated. Death, destruction, and suffering were filtered through lenses of morality and politics, producing a version of events that served those in power while silencing countless voices who actually lived through the catastrophe. As your torchlight flickers over the darkened walls, you realize that the plague isn't just remembered for its deaths. It's remembered for how it was told, spun, and managed. And in that management, the cover-up of reality is as compelling as the disease itself. The corridor stretches ahead, promising maps and myths, a space where even geography could be manipulated for political ends. You leave the echoes of plague behind and step into a hall where the walls are lined with parchments covered in winding lines and strange symbols. Maps, charts, and diagrams hang as if frozen in time, each one a combination of observation, imagination, and political convenience. Geography, like history itself, was being shaped not only by exploration, but by the priorities of those in power. Mainstream fact: medieval mapmakers or cartographers often placed Jerusalem at the center of the world and distorted distances, sometimes leaving entire regions blank or imagined. These maps weren't intended to be perfectly accurate. They were symbolic, political, and sometimes devotional. They reinforced narratives of faith, authority, and cultural hierarchy. A kingdom might appear larger, a border more imposing, or an enemy territory conveniently obscured. Quirky tidbit: some maps included mythical creatures, dragons, sea monsters, and men with dog heads, marking unknown or dangerous territories. One 14th century manuscript depicts a dog-headed people guarding faraway lands, as if warning travelers to mind their manners or prepare for a bizarre encounter. You can almost imagine a sailor pointing at it and thinking, "Better bring a bigger sword and a map that makes sense." Historians still argue whether these distortions were intentional propaganda or simply a reflection of limited information. Were cartographers deliberately reshaping reality to suit rulers, or were they trying their best with fragmented reports and traveler tales? Probably a mix of both. Regardless, the effect is clear. Medieval maps weren't neutral. They curated perception, shaping what people thought existed and what could be ignored. As you wander past these old maps, you notice the interplay of art, narrative, and authority. Coastlines twist unnaturally, rivers run in improbable directions, and entire continents are guessed rather than surveyed. Political needs dictated accuracy. If a king wanted to assert control over a region, maps could be tweaked to make it look bigger, closer, or more defensible than it truly was. You spot a small note in the margin of one map. Do not trust all reports from the east. The cartographer is quietly skeptical, but the main illustration boldly asserts the king's domain. It's a subtle, almost playful form of historical editing. Truth exists, but it is carefully filtered. Here's a humorous mental image. A medieval explorer returns from the edge of a forest, exhausted and muddy, only to see a map depicting a forest twice the size he actually traversed, with griffins patrolling the borders. The truth got lost in translation, and no one dared correct it because authority had already stamped it official. You also notice the omission of entire towns or trade routes. Some roads were erased to hide economic competition, while others were highlighted to support pilgrimages or political claims. Even rivers could be drawn inaccurately to favor a city's strategic importance. This shows how knowledge, just like manuscripts and chronicles, was subject to human interests, not just raw observation. As you step further along, the torchlight catches on faded illustrations of ships navigating imaginary waters. It's clear that maps weren't just tools. They were stories, visually encoding the worldview authorities wanted people to inherit. Borders, monsters, and symbols all work to guide perception, subtly concealing realities that didn't fit the narrative. By the time you reach the next archway, you can see the pattern forming. History can be rewritten not only in words, but in lines, colors, and symbols. Maps, like chronicles, manuscripts, and marginalia, can obscure as much as they reveal. The next room promises yet another layer of this pattern. Kings editing their own stories, crafting legacies that may have little to do with actual events. The corridor opens into a room that smells faintly of ink, parchment, and power, the kind of scent that clings to worn throne rooms and royal archives. Here, history is being manipulated in the most direct way, by kings themselves, or at least by the scribes they employed. Chronicles, annals, and court records were carefully curated, edited, and sometimes invented to craft a usable past that made rulers look competent, heroic, or divinely ordained. Mainstream fact: many medieval chronicles were commissioned by kings to legitimize their rule, justify wars, or smooth over defeats. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, for example, was repeatedly updated to favor the reigning monarch, with certain events emphasized and others downplayed or omitted entirely. Chronicles became tools, as much about perception as documentation. Quirky tidbit: in some instances, chroniclers inserted absurdly heroic feats into otherwise mundane reigns. One French chronicle describes a king riding a massive horse, so large it supposedly required 3 men to lift it into the stable. Scholars suspect exaggeration, but these tales reveal the lengths to which storytellers went to glorify rulers or to entertain themselves while exaggerating the past. Historians still argue whether these embellishments were meant primarily for propaganda or entertainment, or whether scribes simply inherited oral traditions that exaggerated events. Either way, the effect was a subtle manipulation of memory. Victories inflated, defeats minimized, inconvenient actions sanitized, and moral lessons embedded in a story that blended fact and fiction. As you walk past the shelves, you notice how political narratives also affected the depiction of rivals. Defeats of enemies were sometimes portrayed as miraculous victories. Rebellions were reduced to mere missteps by foolish subjects. History, in these cases, becomes a tool of social control, teaching subjects obedience while glorifying authority. You can almost hear the scribes muttering under their breath, "Yes, sire, the battle was totally won, the enemy utterly destroyed, and your horse did indeed trample 7 men at once." It's absurd, but the power of repetition makes the lie permanent. Future generations read these records as truth, because the king's version became the only surviving account. And here's a small joke. One chronicler wrote about a king commanding a river to flow backward to prove divine favor. Obviously, the river didn't obey, but the story persisted for centuries, showing that political storytelling doesn't require feasibility, only belief and careful recording. As you examine the chronicles more closely, you notice subtle patterns. Lists of names rearranged to prioritize allies, years adjusted to justify succession, events shifted in tone to make rulers appear wise. Even minor scribes had incredible power over memory. One careless line could change centuries of perception. You leave the room realizing the danger of absolute narrative control. Kings and scribes had the ability to turn reality into legend and legend back into fact. And just beyond this room, archaeology waits. Modern tools and methods are starting to pry open these polished chronicles, revealing the hidden structures, daily lives, and inconvenient truths that were never meant to survive. The corridor opens into a bright, open chamber, surprisingly airy after the claustrophobic rooms of chronicles and forgeries. Here, the smell is less of parchment and more of earth and stone, the unmistakable scent of archaeology. You can almost feel the dust of centuries brushing against your skin as you step among carefully labeled artifacts, unearthed structures, and fragments of objects that rewrite what the polished texts claim. Mainstream fact: modern archaeology has radically challenged traditional narratives of the Middle Ages. Excavations across Europe have revealed vibrant urban centers, sophisticated trade networks, and technological innovations that contradict the Dark Ages myth. From medieval workshops to irrigation systems and coin hoards, tangible evidence forces historians to reconsider the neat, sanitized accounts left by scribes and chroniclers. Quirky tidbit: in some digs, archaeologists have found medieval chewing gum made from birch bark tar, complete with tooth imprints, sometimes revealing DNA that identifies long-forgotten inhabitants. Imagine brushing off a piece of hardened tar and realizing you can literally trace a medieval smile. It's the kind of unexpected detail that reminds you the past isn't just what was written, it's embedded in the material world. Historians still argue how to interpret these discoveries. Does a sophisticated water system prove widespread literacy and technical knowledge, or is it simply an isolated innovation? Can a small urban market overturn centuries of textual misrepresentation? The debates are ongoing, but one truth emerges clearly. Archaeology adds voices that scribes either ignored or erased. You wander past shards of pottery, charred grains, and remnants of walls, noticing how mundane artifacts illuminate the realities of daily life. Tax rolls, craft tools, and household implements paint a far richer picture than chronicles ever could. You might think the Middle Ages were a barren landscape of mud and superstition, but here, dirt and debris whisper of complexity, invention, and human resilience. And here's a playful aside. In one dig, researchers uncovered a small medieval board game buried under a floor. The pieces are meticulously carved, suggesting evenings spent plotting, strategizing, and perhaps gossiping. People in the Dark Ages apparently enjoyed entertainment far more sophisticated than their reputations imply. Even kings probably lost at board games and then edited the chronicles to cover it up. The chamber hums with the quiet authority of material truth. Coins minted long ago bear inscriptions challenging the official story. Remnants of cathedrals suggest engineering feats previously attributed to later periods. Everyday items reveal trade networks, dietary habits, and cultural exchanges that contradict simplistic portrayals of backwardness. Walking further, you see layers of history stacked physically in the soil, each stratum telling its own story. Archaeology allows these voices to emerge, not just the elite or literate, but craftsmen, women, children, and laborers. The physical remains are a form of truth-telling that bypasses the editorial hand of kings, clerics, and chroniclers. By the time you step through the next archway, you realize that the Middle Ages were far more inventive and complex than the term Dark Ages allows. Innovation, adaptation, and ingenuity often occurred quietly, hidden from official histories. And the next corridor beckons, where economic shifts and hidden innovations reveal yet another layer of historical erasure and cover-up. The corridor now opens into a room where the scent of grain, metal, and wood lingers faintly in the air, and the shadows seem to dance over ledgers, scales, and merchant tools. This is the world of medieval economics, commerce, and the hidden innovations that kept societies running, but which official histories often ignore or simplify. Here, the cover-up isn't just about narratives. It's about the subtle erasure of everyday ingenuity. Mainstream fact: medieval Europe saw a gradual revival of trade and urban growth beginning around the 11th century. Markets flourished, fairs attracted merchants from distant lands, and towns developed rudimentary banking systems to manage complex transactions. Yet, traditional Dark Ages narratives often compress these centuries into a picture of stagnation, erasing the evidence of economic resilience and creativity. Quirky tidbit: some merchants developed clever tricks to track debts, barter efficiently, or hide valuable goods from greedy rulers, like secret compartments in barrels or coded tally sticks. One 13th century document even describes coins being clipped subtly to make small savings or adjustments in transactions. Imagine trying to pay for a loaf of bread and discovering your coin had been stealthily trimmed. It's medieval accounting meets minor thievery. Historians still argue about the scale of these economic innovations and how widespread they truly were. Were these clever systems isolated experiments in a few prosperous towns, or were they part of a broader continental network quietly sustaining societies? Evidence continues to emerge that challenges the notion of a Europe frozen in backwardness. You wander past wooden scales, piles of ledgers, and charred remnants of warehouses. Each artifact speaks to the creativity and adaptability of ordinary people. Merchants navigating unstable currencies, farmers negotiating rites of passage, artisans innovating with tools and materials. Much of this knowledge existed outside the written chronicles, surviving in material evidence or oral traditions that scribes often ignored. And here's a playful detail: some medieval contracts included bizarre clauses to deter cheating, such as penalties involving public humiliation, an awkward dance at the next fair, or even wearing a ridiculous hat. These small but memorable rules show the humor and inventiveness embedded in daily life, which rarely makes it into the textbooks. Walking further, you realize how power shapes memory. Kings, clerics, and chroniclers were far more interested in grand events than the clever survival strategies of townspeople. By downplaying commerce, credit systems, and urban ingenuity, official histories inadvertently promoted the Dark Ages myth. Meanwhile, trade networks quietly flourished, connecting distant regions, enabling the exchange of ideas, and laying the groundwork for the Renaissance. You notice a small ledger that survived a fire, its margins annotated with shorthand notes, accounting tricks, and prices for everything from salt to silk. It's a whisper of continuity, showing that civilization wasn't paused or collapsing. It was evolving quietly, sometimes in defiance of prevailing narratives. By the time you step toward the next chamber, you see a pattern emerging. Economic systems, knowledge networks, and social structures often flourished in obscurity. What survives in the official record is carefully curated, emphasizing rulers, wars, and religious morality while masking the ingenuity of everyday life. The next room promises yet another layer, the spread of ideas across borders, where knowledge traveled faster than official histories would like you to think. The corridor widens, and you step into a hall where the faint scent of ink mixes with parchment, spices, and the occasional whiff of distant seas. Here lies the story of knowledge in motion, the ideas, innovations, and cultural exchanges that traveled across Europe, the Middle East, and beyond, often bypassing official record keepers entirely. This is the hidden flow of information, another aspect of the so-called cover-up of the Dark Ages. Mainstream fact. During the Middle Ages, translations of Arabic texts preserved and transmitted Greek philosophy, mathematics, and science back into Europe. Scholars in places like Toledo worked with texts on astronomy, medicine, and optics, enabling intellectual revival centuries before the Renaissance. This demonstrates that knowledge wasn't lost. It was simply rerouted through networks that were sometimes invisible to later historians. Quirky tidbit. One translator, Gerard of Cremona, reportedly worked so tirelessly that he slept in his study and used his cat to turn pages when his hands were too tired. While it's a humorous anecdote, it highlights the obsession and dedication of people committed to preserving and sharing knowledge, even in conditions modern readers might find extreme. Historians still argue how extensive this transfer of knowledge really was, and whether it was coordinated or simply the result of fortunate circumstances. Did these translations significantly accelerate European learning, or were they niche experiments whose influence was exaggerated in hindsight? Either way, it's clear that ideas continued to flow even when official European records painted a picture of stagnation. You wander past tables cluttered with manuscripts, stacks of translated texts, and diagrams showing everything from astrolabes to medicinal herbs. The influence of cross-cultural exchange is everywhere. Arabic numerals replacing cumbersome Roman counting systems, sophisticated astronomical tables improving calendars, and medical techniques being adopted from distant lands. These innovations quietly transformed society, even if chroniclers preferred to highlight local heroes or religious events. And here's a playful mental image: a medieval student squinting at an Arabic manuscript, muttering, "Why does everything look like a dance of squiggly lines?" Yet, even confusion didn't stop progress. Knowledge moved, adapted, and survived, often under the radar of historians who later labeled centuries as dark. The torchlight flickers on maps with trade routes marked by dots, arrows, and strange symbols. You can trace the movement of goods, ideas, and techniques across mountains, deserts, and seas, realizing that the European Middle Ages were far from isolated. Scholars, merchants, and travelers formed networks of knowledge that persisted despite the chaos of plagues, wars, and political upheaval. As you move toward the next archway, you notice how subtle and pervasive this cover-up was. Official records emphasized kings, battles, and religious authority, while the real engines of change, trade, translation, experimentation, operated quietly, invisibly, yet inexorably reshaping society. The corridors you've walked are filled not only with erased texts and manipulated narratives, but with the persistent hum of ideas that refuse to die. Ahead lies the final chamber. You can feel it. The space where all these threads, the silence, the forgery, the hidden labor, the erased voices, and the quiet currents of knowledge come together. The story of history's biggest cover-up nears its conclusion. You enter the final chamber, a space that feels simultaneously vast and intimate. Dust motes float lazily in the torchlight, settling on scattered scrolls, fragments of manuscripts, charred wood, and overturned chests. This is the sum of centuries of concealment, erasure, and quiet rebellion, the hidden history of the Middle Ages. Every shadow seems to whisper, what survives is only a fraction, carefully curated or accidentally preserved, while the rest has been lost to time, fire, or deliberate silence. Mainstream fact: the Middle Ages were far from uniform in experience. While chronicles often depict chaos, ignorance, and superstition, material evidence shows vibrant urban centers, trade networks, innovation, and resilient communities. Cathedrals soared, aqueducts carried water efficiently, and universities preserved and transmitted knowledge, even in the face of plagues, wars, and political upheaval. The Dark Ages is more a narrative choice than a reality. Quirky tidbit: archaeologists have uncovered medieval graffiti in churches and castles, some irreverent, some humorous, ranging from crude sketches of mythical beasts to witty complaints about sermons. One English cathedral still bears a carving of a knight battling a snail, a surreal joke whose meaning remains debated. It reminds you that everyday people left traces of individuality, humor, and dissent that the grand histories tried to erase. Historians still argue about how much we can trust chronicles versus material evidence. Was history deliberately falsified, or is it simply the result of selective preservation? Probably both. Every surviving text, map, and artifact represents a choice. What to copy, what to preserve, what to burn, and what to omit. Understanding the Middle Ages requires reading between the lines, between the margins, and beneath the stone foundations of buildings themselves. As you wander among these remnants, you notice the patterns recurring. Forged documents like the donation of Constantine, marginalia hiding personal thoughts, erasures of women, merchants, and scientists, fires that destroyed libraries, censored plagues, maps that rearranged reality, chronicles that glorified kings, and the hidden currents of trade, translation, and experimentation. The story of Europe's past has been shaped as much by what was hidden as by what was written. Here's a small joke to ease the gravity. Somewhere, a medieval scribe is probably rolling in his grave, muttering, "I drew the knight fighting a snail, and nobody believed it was a commentary on court politics." Humor, whimsy, and small acts of defiance have survived alongside careful erasures and curated narratives. The cumulative effect is striking. History isn't a clean, linear story. It's a layered tapestry of truth, fiction, omission, and preservation. You realize that the biggest cover-up isn't one document, one king, or one event. It's the systematic shaping of what survives versus what disappears. The accumulation of silences, selective copying, forgery, censorship, and neglect. These actions collectively created the illusion of a dark age, when in reality, life was vibrant, complex, and far more resilient than the official record suggests. You take a moment to absorb the room, imagining centuries of hands touching parchment, carving stone, experimenting with chemicals, navigating trade, and writing secretly in the margins. Each act, minor or monumental, was a thread in the grand tapestry of history, some bright, some faded, some deliberately hidden. And now, as you prepare to leave, you understand that uncovering these threads is what allows us to glimpse the real Middle Ages, beyond the curated narratives, forgeries, and silences. The torchlight flickers one last time, settling on a tiny doodle of a snail carrying a crown. Perhaps it's a joke, a warning, or a reminder. History can be absurd, deliberate, and beautifully human all at once. You breathe in the still air, feel the weight of centuries in your chest, and prepare to step back into the present with a new understanding of what was hidden, erased, or forgotten. Now that the corridors of shadow and parchment have faded behind you, feel your body sink into comfort. Let the weight of the day roll off your shoulders, and imagine the torchlight dimming slowly, the flicker of candle flames softening into a gentle glow. Every whisper, scribble, and erased manuscript drifts like dust in the air, settling quietly, leaving you with the serene knowledge that much of history was carefully curated, but also that the truth can still be glimpsed if you look closely. Breathe in deeply, feeling the cool night air or the faint hum of a fan, and exhale slowly. The stories of forged decrees, erased voices, lost libraries, secret alchemists, and daring merchants are no longer pressing on your mind, but gently floating in the background, like soft echoes fading down a long corridor. Each silenced voice, each playful doodle, each unnoticed innovation reminds you that the past is richer, more nuanced, and more human than official accounts suggest. As your heartbeat slows and your eyelids grow heavier, imagine the margins, the doodles, and the hidden notes wrapping around you like a gentle blanket. Even the tiniest acts of creativity or defiance from centuries ago have survived to whisper in your ear, urging curiosity, patience, and wonder. History isn't just what survives in chronicles. It's in the air, the soil, the ink, and the laughter that refuse to be silenced. Let your thoughts drift further, down corridors of time, past burning libraries, forged documents, secret recipes, and bustling medieval streets. Feel the pulse of people long gone, scribes, merchants, explorers, and everyday citizens, all leaving traces that still echo. Their quiet persistence, humor, and ingenuity are reminders that even when the world seems controlled by authority, life finds a way to speak. Slowly, let the images of torchlight, parchment, and hidden voices fade. Your mind softens, the day dissolves, and a calm, gentle sleep begins to take hold. Drift along the margins of memory, knowing that the stories of the past are vast, layered, and beautifully imperfect, ready to inspire your dreams. End of script. Sweet dreams.